Hello, AstriCon 2025. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it in person this year, so please allow me to present to you my talk, which is Detecting Fraud in FreePBX Using Mostly Built-in Tools. My name is Yitzchak Pachtman. I'm the Director of PBX Engineering at OKG Technologies. So what is on the agenda today? We're going to have a brief introduction. I'm going to explain why I chose this topic, what is fraud in VoIP, what are some popular tools that are used to protect FreePBX and different PBX servers, how we can detect fraudulent calls in FreePBX using built-in technologies, and we're also going to do a quick conclusion, and we'll have some time for questions. So, who am I? My name is Yitzchak Pachtman, also known as Pitsky on the FreePBX forums and on social media. I've been working with OKG Tech for close to a decade by now. OKG Tech is an IT consulting firm. We're located in New York. We have a regular IT MSP services, a low voltage department, a software development department, and a phone system department, which I am directing. I've been using FreePBX since, I would say, mid-2016. And today I have experience with FreePBX, most asterisk-based phone systems, Cameo, audio codes, Homer, and I'm a big fan of Debian. So why did I choose this topic? Aren't there like more cooler stuff to talk about, right? There's artificial intelligence, ARI, speech to text, text to speech, high availability integrations, dynamic applications, and the list goes on and on. But I decided to go back to the basics, right? And it's not just about going back to the basics. It's also about sharing your experiences. And your experiences are the mistakes that you made, and you share those mistakes with others so they don't have to go through at the beginning of the journey and make the same mistakes that you made. And obviously, I want to give back. I want to share the experience that I have, and I want to contribute as much as I can back to the community, back to the people who helped me out when I was a beginner, right? So FreePBX is literally the most popular open source VoIP toolkit, right? It's not just a phone system, but you can do many, many more things than just a simple phone call with asterisk and FreePBX. In fact, most popular carriers were expressing their commitment to FreePBX. And if you take a look at the forums, you can see that Bandwidth was contributing. I don't know in what form, but they were a big supporter of the project. You can see Telnix was like I think it was the CEO of Telnix, if I remember correctly, that once posted in the FreePBX forums, his love for FreePBX. So, I mean, there's a ton of users who are just hobbyists, and there are a ton of users who are just beginners. But between the two, there are beginners and hobbyists who turn out to be experts, down the road. But everyone is starting at a beginner phase where their knowledge in FreePBX, asterisk, VoIP, SIP is very, very minimal, right? And when you're a hobbyist and you don't want to go to nightmare, but welcome to everyone's biggest nightmare, which is my PBX system was hacked. So what is fraud in VoIP? Not to confuse it with DDoS, right? DDoS is a major issue. Whoever remembers in Q4 of 2021, there were very large DDoS attacks on very big carriers, Bandwidth, Telnix, if I remember correctly, it was VoIP.ms, and some more carriers, right? And if you want to read a little bit more about these DDoS attacks, there are plenty of good discussions on the FreePBX forums around that time with good explainers. And, we're not going to talk about DDoS today, but if you think that you could potentially be a victim of DDoS, if you're a small company, then an SBC or Cameo should be sufficient to protect your phone systems. But if you're a bigger, larger, enterprise provider, you should look at different solutions such as Cloudflare, and they also have a very good article describing and documenting what happened back then in 2021 with the amount of DDoS attacks and the amount of data that they were able to mitigate to protect their customers. It's a very, very, very good article. I suggest anyone and everyone to read it. It's going to widen a lot your knowledge in terms of DDoS protection, specifically around VoIP phone systems. So what is fraud in phone systems, right? So it's mainly unwanted or unauthorized phone calls. And it's not just basically an unauthorized or unwanted phone call. It's usually these calls are placed to high cost or international phone numbers. And, just to give you a little bit of details of and statistics of the amount of fraud or VoIP fraud that is happening in the industry, it's estimated around between 30 to 50 billion dollars in losses annually, specifically in the VoIP industry. Right, in 2023, telecommunications fraud were increased by 12%. That's a huge number. In 2009, there were an Australian company that had been hacked, and just 46 hours they had losses of $120,000. In 2011, there was a US-based incident. In just a single weekend, they lost $1.4 million. There are posts on the PBX and the Flash forums. I don't know if that forums happens to be still around, but I remember reading there of a user who posted that in 12 hours, they lost close to $50,000 simply by using weak passwords, right? And there are many, many more incidents. You can read about them online on the FreePBX and AstriCon forums or on many other VoIP forums. So how does it happen, right? So there are common entry points such as a weak password, an attacker is trying to brute force, or if an attacker is able to put their hands on a provisioning file that contains the subcredentials. There are applications within AstriCon or FreePBX, such as DISA, which allows an external caller to call in and either with or without a password, place an outgoing phone call. There are some, attendant or blind transfer options that you can utilize DTMF to perform a transfer. So an attacker can call in, transfer a phone call to an international or high-cost phone number. And there's the final one, which, as far as I'm aware, is a voicemail application where some voicemail systems, some asterisk systems allow, it's essentially a feature with an asterisk, a parameter which you can enable or disable. But if it's enabled, it would allow a person to call in, authenticate with their voicemail password, and place an outgoing phone call. And obviously, if a phone system was compromised, such as, an attacker gained SSH access, then they can just run a script to generate phone calls either through the command line or through call files or through ARI or whatever way asterisk allows you to generate phone calls. So what are common prevention tools that are used to protect FreePBX? So FreePBX has a built-in firewall, which can act in two ways. One is just like a regular firewalls driven by IP tables where you can whitelist or set your rules who you allow to connect, or it has a responsive firewall, which allows, as far as I understand, a certain amount of time or a certain amount of connections before it blocks the IP address. There's also fail to ban, which is very popular. If you haven't really, reviewed your fail to ban settings, I strongly encourage you to still go look at your fail to ban settings today and make sure that they are properly configured. There's another popular project gaining a lot of traction recently. It's API ban by Fred Posner, which is a really, really useful tool. The idea is that it blocks known attackers, right? So you can have it installed in a single phone system, on many phone systems. I believe there's a limit on how many systems you can use per key, but it's free and you should use it. And trust me, it doesn't really add any overhead on your phone system. It's a very, very minimal application and doesn't really use a lot of resources. But if the FreePBX tools are not good enough to protect your phone system, you can obviously use Kamailio as an edge, where Kamailio can add a ton of different rules and sets to determine who can pass through Kamailio to your phone system. You can use the main authentication, you can inspect the source IP, and based on geographical location, decide if you want to allow that connection to pass through, and so forth, right? And it's something that I usually recommend is just generally keep your phone system behind a firewall. So if something happens, you have a way to just simply block incoming and outgoing traffic. So these were just regular tools that you can use to prevent attackers or malicious people from, trying to access your phone system. But what happens if an attacker was already able to authenticate? They managed to gather your SIP credentials, they managed to obtain it from somewhere, and they can now place outgoing phone calls. So today we're going to talk how we can utilize some different tools within FreePBX to detect and get notified or take action once these malicious calls are happening. So we're going to take a look at custom context, at endpoint manager, SIP domain, from name, time groups, plus outbound routes, right? So let's first start with custom context. So FreePBX has a default custom context, which is from -internal. All extensions on the phone system are assigned to use that context, and any extension that places an outgoing call, it's going to start with the from -internal context. Now, under extensions, and then you edit an individual extension, you can change that. So that would allow us to essentially intercept the call before we send it to the from -internal context. And in that interception, we can add our own rules and determine if that person or that connection that is currently trying to place an outgoing call through FreePBX is legitimate or not. So one important note, this is only going to work if you don't have installed a custom context module, right? So if you go to connectivity, custom context, I believe there's a legacy module around for many, many years. It's not going, theoretically, you should be able to make it work with that module, but it would be easier without that module, right? And the idea of overriding to use a custom context is going to be required for the next 3 steps. So the first one would be endpoint manager. And for endpoint manager, we're going to use the from -mac. So what do I mean by, endpoint manager? So a regular phone system, or let's put it this way, a smaller phone system where you have 10 IP phones and you provision them all in endpoint manager. And in endpoint manager, you have the section which is extension mapping, where you map an extension with a MAC address, right? And it obviously contains the MAC address, the extension number, the brand, the model, and if you have an expansion module. So a lot of these IP phones or desk phones allow you to enable that on every invite the device sends, it should also include its MAC address. So what we can do is just simply read from the SIP header and every incoming invite that reaches the FreePBX, we can read and understand what MAC address is sending this invite, right? So all we need to do then is to just use the endpoint manager database table and validate that this MAC address indeed belongs to this extension, right? And if it doesn't, then just block the call and send an email. So here is how the dial plan would look, right? So you would have the simple from that MAC, right? And you can see here, the first thing what we do is we no op and we print the MAC address that we see in this PJSIP header, which is usually in the user agent. And then we use the asterisk ODBC function to perform just a regular SQL query where we compare, like I said earlier, the MAC address with this extension. If it matches, then fine, we send it to the from-internal context and the call continues normally. If it doesn't, what I'm doing here, you can see is that I first set EIP, which is the endpoint IP address, and then I match the IP address, which is the WAN IP of the client, to try to determine which country it's originating from. Then I'm gathering the information on fail to ban if it's running or not running, and I can just send an email that, hey, this IP address from this country is trying to place a call, an unauthorized call, and you just play, this call cannot be completed as a dial. Please check the number and dial again, and you terminate the call. So that would be, utilizing the endpoint manager on every incoming call, which you already have. You have the list of your devices, you have the MAC addresses, and as soon as if someone just steals the username and password and they don't know to send an additional user agent header that contains the MAC address, then they won't be able to place a call. Then there's like I mentioned earlier, FreePBX or Asterisk doesn't allow, Asterisk itself, they do allow you to do domain authentication, but within FreePBX, it's not built in by default. So what we can do is do domain authentication, but with a twist, right? So in FreePBX, under every extension, you have a section to specify an account code under each extension. So instead of specifying an account code, you can specify a domain. And that domain should match with what the device is registering against, right? So let's say it's company1.domain.com. Add company1.domain.com to your extension account code. And we're going to utilize the SIP domain variable from Asterisk and check if it matches with the account code. So here's a similar dial plan. It's just from -domain that you would enter under the extension. And we're going to match here, like I said earlier, the domain with what we have in the account code section. The next thing would be from name. So an attacker that would be able to gather your SIP credentials. He managed to gather your SIP credentials. Most likely, he's just going to enter the SIP credentials in a Python script or whatever script he has, and he's going to try to initiate these phone calls. The differences between one of the differences is between these Python scripts and a regular desk phone is a regular desk phone was provisioned, and it contains all the parameters. It contains the proper from name, which is usually generated by the phone system, which is the extension name. It contains the extension number, all the details, the BLF keys, and so forth, right? So what we can do is that if these phones are provisioned, similar to the first step, which is through Endpoint Manager, so if these phones were all provisioned through Endpoint Manager, it's safe to assume that all these phones have a proper from name set. So all we need to do is just match the from header and the extension name that we have in FreePBX. So here would be also an example dial plan that would just simply allow you to match the from header and the extension name to what you have in FreePBX. Obviously, if you change the extension number and if you change the extension name and didn't reprovision the phone, this is going to block you. Finally, outbound routes, right? So outbound routes are not just outbound routes, but before we touch on outbound routes, the first 3 steps were essentially preventing people or attackers from reaching your phone system, meaning as soon as they reach your phone system, you're gatekeeping them and not allowing them to place any outgoing calls. But what if a person managed to gain access to your phone system, authenticate with the SIP credentials. Now they can place an outgoing call. You don't want to end up looking like these people who found themselves with thousands of dollars of losses over the weekend. We want to know if these calls are happening on our phone system. So how can we detect that, right? So outbound routes is not just a simple an outbound route. So what we're going to see here is sort of like a recipe that would allow you to get notified and take action if there are malicious calls on your phone system. So first, you don't want to have just a single outbound route. You want to create individual routes for domestic versus international, right? So regular calls or potential high cost calls. And then you want to create different outbound routes. So for example, let's say you would have domestic business hours and domestic after hours. So it would essentially look like this, right? You have 4 outbound routes, and you can see here on the right that all of these outbound routes are tied to a time group. So for example, domestic office hours would be 9 to 5. Domestic after hours would be the rest of the hours. Same thing with international office hours and international after hours. Right? So it's not just simply about outbound routes, it's also about the dial plan. So in the dial plan, what we can do is we can set a limit of how many concurrent calls we want to allow per outbound route. So how do we do that? We first have to get the route ID. So you can see here on the right, we set every outbound route, like once you click edit, you can see the actual ID of the outbound route, right? So once we have that, we can go ahead later. I'll show you in just a second the dial plan. We can group these concurrent calls, and if it exceeds that limit, we can take action, right? So the key is here, we use the group count function in asterisk, and if it exceeds, for example, more than 10, then do X. So here's the dial plan, right? So the first thing that we do is we group the calls with the route ID. So the first would be, let's say, ID 1, the second would be ID 2, 3, 4, or whatever it is, right? And then we say how many phone calls, how many concurrent phone calls are we allowing to pass through that outbound route? So for example, domestic calls or local calls during business hours, I would say I have an average of 10 concurrent phone calls, or at maximum, I have 10 concurrent phone calls throughout, the business day. And if it exceeds, then we know that something is happening. Same thing is with after hours. If our after hours outbound route for local calls has more than 4 concurrent calls, something is happening. And of course, we're international, right? So throughout the day, there shouldn't be more than 5 international concurrent phone calls, and after hours, there shouldn't be more than 2. And if it exceeds these limits, you can just simply send it, to send call counter email, which you can do just to send a simple email. And obviously, if it's less, it's just going to return. So if I got to mention one important point, this is using the pre-dial hook, the trunk pre-dial hook. So there's a very good post on the FreePBX forums from Lauren. It's titled Hooking for Fun and for Income, which explains in detail how these hooks works in FreePBX. I encourage everyone to take a look at that. It's very, very useful when it comes to add integrations in FreePBX and to do a little bit of out-of-the-box things. So we're utilizing this trunk pre-dial hook, and before we allow this outgoing call to happen, we check here how many concurrent calls are happening per outbound route, and obviously, if it exceeds the limit, we're going to take action, right? So I mentioned here 4 different kind of things. You can obviously, first of all, do whatever works best for you. You don't have to use all of them. You can use one or more method. You can chain the dial plans one with another. So for example, you can combine endpoint manager and the from domain or and from user. And you can obviously take better actions either in your outbound routes or even in the other applications where, for example, you can run, let's say if you can just write your own rule to say that if the after hours outbound route for international calls is exceeding more than, I don't know, 50% or even 10% more than the limit you set, then just run FW console, disable trunk, and pass your trunk ID, so you know that no outgoing calls can happen whatsoever until somebody actually logs back into the system and re-enables that trunk. So there's a lot of ways that you can take action. Doesn't necessarily mean to just send you an email notification, because if nobody's checking their emails after hours, then there's no point of this whole add-on. So like I said, to disable the trunks and so forth. That's about it. Thank you so much for listening. And obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to ask away. I hope to be live after the session, or feel free to reach out on the forums or on social media. Thank you so much, and hopefully I'll see you guys in person next year.